Hi, this is Luke Johnson for Noetic. Going to read a book review by Herman Melville. This recording copyright 2020 Noetic Series LLC. Etchings of a whaling cruise with notes of a sojourn on the island of Zanzibar, to which is appended a brief history of the whale fishery, its past and present condition, by J. Ross Brown, illustrated with numerous engravings on steel and wood. Harper and Brothers, 1846, 8 volumes. Sailor's Life and Sailor's Yarns by Captain Ringbolt, New York, C.S. Francis and Company, 1847, 12 mo. From time immemorial, many fine things have been said and sung of the sea. The days have been when sailors were considered veritable mermen, and the ocean itself as the peculiar theater of the romantic and wonderful. But of late years, there have been revealed so many plain, matter-of-fact details connected with nautical life, that at the present day, the poetry of salt water is very much on the wane. The perusal of Dana's 2 years before the mast, for instance, somewhat impairs the relish with which we read Byron's spiritual address to the ocean. And when the noble poet raves about laying his hands upon the ocean's mane, in other words, manipulating the crest of a wave, the most vivid image suggested is that of a valetudinarian bather at Rockaway, spluttering and choking in the surf with his mouth full of brine. Mr. J. Ross Brown's narrative tends still further to impair the charm with which poetry and fiction have invested the sea. It is a book of unvarnished facts, and with some allowances for the general application of an individual example, unquestionably presents a faithful picture of the life led by the 20,000 seamen employed in the 700 vessels which now pursue their game under the American flag. Indeed, what Mr. Dana had so admirably done in describing the vicissitudes of the merchant sailor's life, Mr. Brown has very creditably achieved with respect to that of the hardy whaleman's. And the book which possesses this merit deserves much in the way of commendation. The personal narrative interwoven with it also cannot fail to enlist our sympathies for the adventurous author himself. The scenes presented are always graphically and truthfully sketched, and hence fastidious objections may be made to some of them on the score of their being too coarsely or harshly drawn. But we take it that as true, unreserved descriptions, they are in no respect faulty, and doubtless the author never dreamed of softening down or withholding anything with a view of rendering his sketches the more attractive and pretty. The book is eminently a practical one, and written with the set purpose of accomplishing good by revealing the simple truth, when the brutal tyranny of the captain of the Styx is painted without apology or palliation. It holds up the outrageous abuse to which seamen in our whaling marine are actually subjected, or rather which demands legislation. Mr. Brown himself, it seems, was to some extent the victim of the tyranny of which he complains, and upon this ground the personal bitterness in which he at times indulges may be deemed excusable. As the book professes to embrace a detailed account of all that is interesting in the business of whaling, and essentially possesses this merit, one or two curious errors into which the author has unaccountably fallen may, without captiousness, be pointed out. We are told, for example, of a whale's roaring when wounded by the harpoon. We can imagine the veteran Coffins and Colemans and Macy's of old Nantucket elevating their brows at the bare announcement of such a thing. Now the creature in question is as dumb as a shad or any other of the finny tribes, and no doubt if Jonah himself could be summoned to the stand, he would cheerfully testify to his not having heard a single syllable, growl, grunt, or bellow engendered in the ventricle cells of the Leviathan during the irksome period of his incarceration therein. That in some encounters with the sperm whale, a low, indistinct sound apparently issues from the monster is true enough. But all Nantucket and New Bedford are decided as to the causes which produce the phenomenon. Many suppose, however, that it is produced not by the creature itself, but by the peculiar motion in the water of the line which is attached to the harpoon. For if upon being struck the whale sounds, descends, as is usually the case, and remains below the surface for any length of time, the rope frequently becomes as stiff as the cord of a harp, and the struggles of the animal keep it continually vibrating. Considering the disenchanting nature of the revelations of sea life with which we are presented in Mr. Brown's book, we are inclined to believe that the shipping agents in our various cities, by the merchants of New Bedford, will have to present additional inducements to enterprising and industrious young Americans of good moral character, in order to persuade them to embark in the fishery. In particular, the benevolent old gentleman in Front Street, one of the shipping agents of whom our author discourseth, who so politely accosted Brown and his comrade upon their entering his office for the purpose of seeking further information touching the rate of promotion in the whaling service. This old gentleman, we say, must hereafter infuse into his address still more of the suaviter in modo. As unaffectedly described by Brown, the scene alluded to is irresistibly comic. The agent's business, be it understood, consists in decoying green hands to send on to the different whaling ports. A conspicuous placard without the office announces to the anxious world that a few choice vacancies remain to be filled in certain crews of whalemen about to sail upon the most delightful voyages imaginable. Only 4 years is long. To secure a place, of course, instant application should be made. Our author and his friend, attracted by the placard, hurry up a ladder to a dark loft above, where the old man lurks like a spider in the midst of his toils. But a single glance at the gentlemanly dress and white hands of his visitors impresses the wily agent with the idea that, notwithstanding their calling upon him, they may very possibly have heard disagreeable accounts of the nature of whaling. So, after making a bow and offering a few legs of a chair, he proceeds to disabuse their minds of any unfavorable impressions. Succeeding in this, he then becomes charmingly facetious and complimentary, assures the youths that they need not be concerned because of their slender waists and silken muscles, for those who employed him were not so particular about weight as beauty. In short, the captains of whaling vessels preferred handsome young fellows who dressed well and conversed genteelly. In short, those who would reflect credit upon the business of tarring down rigging and cutting up blubber. Delighted with the agreeable address of the old gentleman, and with many pleasant anticipations of sea life, the visitors listen with increased attention, whereupon the agent waxes eloquent and enlarges upon his animating theme in the style parliamentary, a whaler gentleman. He observes is the home of the unfortunate, the asylum of the oppressed, etc., etc., etc. Duped Brown, hapless H. In the end, they enter into an engagement with the old gentleman, who subsequently sends them on to New Bedford, consigned to a mercantile house there. From New Bedford, the adventurers at length sail in a small whaling bark bound to the Indian Ocean. While yet half dead with seasickness, the unfortunate H is sent by the brutal captain to the masthead to stand there his allotted 2 hours on the lookout for whale spouts. He receives a stroke of the sun which for a time takes away his reason and endangers his life. He raves of home and friends, and poor Brown, watching by his side, upbraids himself for having been concerned in bringing his companion to such a state. Ere long the vessel touches at the Azores, where H, being altogether unfit for duty, is left to be sent home by the American consul. He never recovered from the effects of his hardships, for in the sequel Brown relates that After reaching home himself, he visited his old friend in Ohio and found him still liable to temporary prostrations directly referable to his sufferings at sea. With a heavy heart, our author, after leaving the Azores, weathers the Cape of Good Hope and enters upon the Indian Ocean. The ship's company, composed mostly of ignorant, half civilized Portuguese from the Western Islands, are incessantly quarreling and fighting. The provisions are of the most wretched kind. Their success in the fishery is small, and to crown all, the captain himself is the very incarnation of all that is dastardly, mean, and heartless. We cannot follow Brown through all his adventures. Suffice it to say that, heartily disgusted with his situation, he at length, with great difficulty, succeeds in leaving the vessel on the coast of Zanzibar. There he tarries for some months, and his residence in this remote region, the eastern coast of Africa near Madagascar, enables him to make sundry curious observations upon men and things of which the reader of his work has the benefit. From Zanzibar, he ultimately sails for home in a merchant brig, and at last arrives in Boston, thoroughly out of conceit of the ocean. Give ear now, all ye shore disdaining, ocean enamored youth, who labor under the lamentable delusion that the sea, the glorious sea, is always and in reality the blue, the fresh, the ever free. Give ear to Mr. J. Ross Brown, and hearken unto what that experienced young gentleman has to say about the manner in which Barry Cornwall has been humbugging the rising generation on this subject. Alas, hereafter we shall never look upon an unsophisticated stripling in flowing duck trousers and a light blue jacket loitering away the interval which elapses before sailing on his maiden cruise, without mourning over the hard fate in store for him. In a ship's forecastle, alas, he will find no Psyche glass in which to survey his picturesque attire. And the business of making his toilet will be comprised in trying to keep as dry and comfortable as the utter absence of umbrellas, wet decks, and leaking forecastles will admit of. We shudder at all realities of the career they will be entering upon, the long, dark, cold night watches which month after month they must battle out the best way they can. The ship pitching and thumping against the bullying waves, every plank dripping, every jacket soaked, and the captain, not at all bland in issuing his order for the poor fellows to mount aloft, and the icy sleet and howling tempest. Bless me, captain, go away up there this excessively disagreeable night. Aye, up with you, you lubber, bear, I say, or look out for squalls. A figurative expression conveying a remote allusion to the hasty application of a sea bludgeon to the head. Then the whaling part of the business. My young friends, just fancy yourselves for the first time in an open boat, so slight that 3 men might walk off with it, some 12 or 15 miles from your ship, and about 100 times as far from the nearest land, giving chase to one of the oleaginous monsters. Pull, pull, you lubberly haymakers, cries the boat header, jumping up and down in the stern sheets in a frenzy of professional excitement, while the gasping admirers of Captain Marryat and the sea tug with might and main at the truckling oars. Pull, pull, I say, break your lazy backs. Presently the whale is within darting distance, and you hear the roar of the waters in his wake. How palpitating the hearts of the frightened oarsmen at this interesting juncture. My young friends, just turn round and snatch a look at that whale. There he goes, surging through the brine, which ripples about his vast head as if it were the bow of a ship. Believe me, it's quite as terrible as going into battle to a raw recruit. Stand up and give it to him, shrieks the boat header at the steering oar to the harpooner in the bow. The latter drops his oar and snatches his iron. It flies from his hands, and where are we then, my lovelies? It's all a mist, a crash, a horrible blending of sounds and sights, as the agonized whale lashes the water around him into the suds and vapor, dashes the boat aside, and at last rushes madly through the water, towing after him the half-filled craft. which rocks from side to side while the disordered crew clutch at the gunwale to avoid being tossed out. Meanwhile, all sorts of horrific edged tools, lances, harpoons, and spades are slipping about, and the imminent line itself smoking round the loggerhead and passing along the entire length of the boat is almost death to handle, though it grazes your person. But all this is nothing to what follows. As yet, you have but simply fastened to the whale. He must be fought and killed. But let imagination supply the rest, the monster staving the boat with a single sweep of his ponderous flukes, taking its bows between his jaws, as is frequently the case, and playing with it as a cat with a mouse. Sometimes he bites it in twain, sometimes crunches it into chips and strews the sea with them. But we forbear. Enough has been said to convince the uninitiated what sort of a vocation whaling in truth is. If further information is desired, Mr. Brown's book is purchasable, in which they will find the whole matter described in all its interesting details. After reading the Etchings of a Whaling Cruise, a perusal of sailor's life and sailor's yarns is one in respect at least like hearing the other side of the question. For while Brown's is a voice from the forecastle, Captain Ringbolt hails us from the quarterdeck, the other end of the ship. Brown gives us a sailor's version of sailor's wrongs, and is not altogether free from prejudices acquired during his little experience on shipboard. Captain Ringbolt almost denies that the sailor has any wrongs, and more than insinuates that sea captains are not only the best-natured fellows in the world, but that they have been sorely maligned. Indeed, he explicitly charges Mr. Dana and Mr. Brown with having presented a decidedly one-sided view of the matter, and he manfully exclaims that the captain of the Pilgrim, poor fellow, died too soon to vindicate his character from unjust aspersions. Now, as a class, ship owners are seldom disposed partially to judge the captains in their employ, and yet we know of a verity that at least one of the owners of the Pilgrim, an esteemed citizen of the good old town of Boston, will never venture to dispute that to the extent of his knowledge at least, Mr. Dana's captain was a most strict and harsh disciplinarian, which words so applied by a ship owner mean that the man in question was nothing less than what Mr. Dana describes him to have been. But where's Brown's captain? He is alive and hearty, we presume. Let him come forward, then, and show why he ought not to be regarded in the decidedly unfavorable light in which he is held up to us in the narrative we have noticed. Now, for aught we know to the contrary, the same captain of the Styx, who was such a heartless, domineering tyrant at sea, may be quite a different character ashore. In truth, we think this very probable, for the god Janus never had two more decidedly different faces than your sea captain. Ashore, his nautical highness is nothing to ruffle him. Friends grasp him by the hand, and are overjoyed to see him after his long absence. He is invited out, relates his adventures pleasantly, and everybody thinks what lucky dogs his sailors must have been to have sailed with such a capital fellow. But let poor Jack have a word to say. Why, sir, he will tell you that when they embarked, his nautical highness left behind him all his quips and cranks and wreathed smiles. Very far indeed is the captain from cracking any of his jokes with his crew. That would be altogether too condescending. But then there is no reason why he should bestow a curse every time he gives an order. There is no reason why he should never say a word of sympathy to his men. True, in this respect, all sea captains are not alike, but still there's enough of truth in both Mr. Dana's and Mr. Brown's statements to justify nearly to the full the general conclusions to be drawn from what they have said on this subject. But Captain Ringbolt's book is very far from being a mere plea for the class to which he belongs. What he has to say upon the matter is chiefly contained in one brief sketch under the head of Sailors' Rights and Sailors' Wrongs. The rest of the book is made up of little stories of the sea, simply and pleasantly told, and withal entertaining. The Literary World, March 6, 1847.